Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma-informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm here today with my good friend Kate Wells to talk about trauma and eating disorders. I met Kate in Albany, New York, and we really connected on a trip I took out there in, I believe it was January or February. Not all I remember because it was a great training, but I remember it was raining and snowing at the same time. It was a very weird weather pattern that I was in when I was out there. But Kate was generous enough to find a great vegan restaurant for me in Albany, and enjoyed a great meal, got talking about trauma and her passion for working with folks struggling with eating disorders. And I was like, I got to get Kate on the show to talk about a subject I will just throw out there I don't know that much about. I'm almost dangerous with this topic. So I actually had to think about what questions could I ask, but I'm hoping Kate teaches me and gives us a lot of knowledge on it. I think what's a very crucial, and I think my lack of knowledge on it doesn't mean a lot of my clients probably weren't struggling with this in some ways. I just didn't have the awareness of it. So Kate, I'm really excited to have you on the show today. Can you just give our folks an introduction of yourself?
Yes, thanks, Matt. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on today. So I am Kate Wells. I'm a clinical social worker. I currently work full-time at an eating disorder clinic, providing intensive outpatient services, but also direct therapy to our patients. I also have worked in substance abuse, and I also have done administrative work in the HIV clinic. So I'm glad to be a part of this podcast. I have a huge passion for the eating disorder population, and can't wait to have this discussion.
All right, Kate. So I thought about, okay, it's something this is probably the least knowledgeable I'm on any topic we've covered in 117 episodes. So I was like, what question can I ask that makes me seem smarter than I am? And well, I could probably do a decent job at naming some eating disorders and maybe some of the symptoms of those. I'm gonna give you a really, really difficult question.
Okay.
What's an eating disorder?
So an eating disorder, believe it or not, is the opposite of what a lot of people think. Their viewpoint of an eating disorder is someone that does not eat at all, which is the typical diagnosis of anorexia nervosa. But an eating disorder is really having an unhealthy relationship with food, an unhealthy relationship with our body image. And our goal while working with our patients is to work on having a better relationship with food, whether people struggle with eating food or with people that struggle with overeating food. We also look at body image because you can't work on an eating disorder without tackling a hard topic as body image. And what do we really look like when we are staring at ourselves in the mirror? Is it accurate to how others are viewing us?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's what I asked that question a little bit in jest, but when I was thinking deeper about it, it's that relationship to food that I think, you got the anorexic bulimia. I mean, you have the ones that, I probably learned honestly as much about on, TV than, clinically in any of the classes I took in my psychology work. And I think that when we start to talk about that, it brings up a lot of complexity. And I think whether it was, I worked with kids in special education that they just eat anything. And it was like we would have to things would disappear, and we're like, is this an emergency room call? And then with the others working with teenage girls and the child welfare system. So many issues just around food. Not that we were always paying enough attention to it as well. So with the folks that you serve that, you know, are coming in specifically for that, what are some of the, maybe some causes? Obviously we want to talk about trauma, but what in your experience and your learning, what leads to this relationship with food that can cause issues in a lot of different directions?
So, with my experience working with patients with eating disorder, the three common themes that I've noticed. The first has been for a child growing up in a household that their parents struggle with their relationship of food. At a young age, they are taught that food is bad, and that there is an emphasis on working out and eating healthy, so that when the child gets into middle school, they still have those thoughts. And as their bodies develop and change through puberty, they try to modify those areas that they do not like. The second common theme is bullying. For a lot of the patients that I work with, it is, you know, that one experience that someone noticed their body and made note of if they were too big. And then it stuck with them, and it was a seed that was planted in their head and something that they couldn't get out. So they examine, how do I lose this weight now that I've been identified as the specific title?
Yeah.
And then the third would be the peer pressure with social media. You know, throughout, you know, Instagram and Facebook and all of the social media platforms, a lot of kids and adults are seeing a workout culture that sometimes can be unhealthy, or also the different fad diets that everybody wants to try, but we don't succeed in because we're not getting all of the nourishment that we need. For a lot of our patients, they're stuck in all three of these themes, and they have a hard time looking at themselves differently than what these different areas have emphasized to them.
Wow. And so let's go to because, you know, bullying, I think if you've ever been bullied, it's a traumatic experience with that. I wonder, when you start to look at that piece and just kind of the general role of trauma, I just kind of wonder, when you're working, kind of the experience that you're seeing in your work about the trauma histories of the folks that you serve. And then kind of a follow-up question to that, how within the work of, and I'm not sure if I'm using the right word, of healing or treating the eating disorder, how does past trauma figure into that treatment as well?
Well, I think for most of the patients that I work with, they do have a past history of trauma based off the experience of that first time that they felt that their body was viewed in a negative way. But I also think that they have dealt with other trauma, whether it's been divorce of parents, whether it's been continued bullying on other factors, sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, neglect. A lot of the patients that I work with, you know, the common theme is, hey, Kate, I can't talk to anybody, you know, and I feel really alone. And one thing that we emphasize is that you're not alone and that your feelings are valid. And, you know, we process some of this past trauma and the core beliefs of what the trauma has led them to think. And we work through that process of acceptance and how do we move forward so we don't continue to relive that ongoing trauma.
Yeah. And so does, like, you know, like trauma treatment as we conceptualize it, whether it's trauma informed cognitive behavioral therapy, or even kind of maybe the EMDR sort of best practice, does that figure into anybody? And I know everybody's journey is unique, but does that come into play at all when you're working with somebody through those probably some intense traumatic histories as well?
Absolutely. So some of the modalities that we use at our clinic, we rely heavily on DBT, and utilizing those skills that when someone is having a trauma response and in that distress, what are those skills that they can use to work forward versus engaging in eating disorder behaviors. We also use CBT to work through some of those thought patterns how to view things in a more positive manner. When our brain is stuck on this negative image of ourselves and everything is doom and gloom, we try to challenge some of those thoughts to be more positive, look at what is going for them and how to change the negative into a positive, working on radical acceptance, checking the facts. A lot of those different DBT and CBT skills we utilize while in group, but also in session with our patients.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so here's where my ignorance is probably going to start to be a bright sunshine in this conversation. So one of the things, if you would ask me, hey Matt, what do you think about eating disorders? Where I would acknowledge I'm not an expert in that area is, one of the things that I think with my exposure to that, mostly working with, again, teenage girls is where it became a focus, though I think part of my ignorance is I didn't recognize it in the boys we were working with and some of the trans folks as well.
Absolutely.
Was the idea of control. And I wonder if is that still sort of, you talked a lot about the kind of external environmental pressures, but my again, it may be an uninformed opinion, but it's like the rest, there's a lot of my life that's kind of out of control. This is one of the things that I can control. And that wouldn't be obviously with overeating necessarily, but with not eating, that sort of piece. Is that still part of the thinking with the reasons behind the eating disorders?
Absolutely. So for most of the patients that I've had the pleasure of working with, it is, their environment or what's going on around them feels so out of control that their eating disorder is the one thing they can control. Their body is what they can control. Yeah. The way that they appear outward to people is what they can control. And it also goes for the binge eaters too. That sense of control. This is my way of coping. This is what I need in order to deal with what's around me and the obstacles that I face. It's funny you bring up the females, but as time's gone on and the longer that I've worked in the field, we are seeing a lot more males in eating disorder treatment than we traditionally had before, because eating disorders was such a female diagnosis that for a lot of males, they didn't think that they could have an eating disorder because of how eating disorders are portrayed in our society. But as time has gone on and there's been more research in the field of eating disorders, that we are seeing more, young adolescent boys coming in saying that, this is the image that I want to be. And I've been, restricting, or I've been trying to overeat to have that perfect body. Or, my family life is out of control, or I was an overweight kid and I don't want people to look at me as the fat kid. So now this was my way of getting back that control so people looked at me differently.
Yeah. And how do you see, because I mean, one of the things that, I always, and I'll just say this because it pops out in my mind when we think about males with this is I, being a basketball player growing up, we would always be in the gym practicing. And then there would be these crazy wrestlers who would have garbage bags and sweatsuits on trying to make weight. And we were just looking at them like, these guys are crazy. Like, and they would talk about not eating for weeks at a time leading up. And there would seem to be these like sports. And then and it's not a culture that I'm totally engrossed in, but again, being an athlete, was exposed to sort of the bodybuilding sort of mentality where it almost seemed like in some ways an addiction. And I don't use that word lightly. It was, I would watch, if they couldn't get in the weight room, it was almost like a panic attack for some of these guys I knew. And I know that's also, my exposure was to male athletes, but I know, I've heard women talk about it in the same way as well. And I just kind of wonder, like, that pressure that whether it's structural, like through a sport, or that kind of addiction, if I could use that word, to working out and trying to get that perfect body, which I think in bodybuilding often looks not so perfect to most of us, but they're striving for something, you know, and I just kind of wonder, like, you know, a lot of times we think about not eating or binging and purging, like the kind of the things that get ingrained through our culture about eating disorders, but kind of wonder about some of those nuances that you see as well.
Absolutely. So I think for a lot of kids just in general in sports, there is an emphasis on perfection, which then
Mhm.
fuels an eating disorder. You know, it is an addictive behavior that, you know, I always say to my patients, it's like when we opened Pandora's box, when we noticed
Yeah.
that this behavior gave us the gratification and the feeling that we needed, it's something that they continued to do because it was a way of coping, but it also made them feel better about themselves, made
Mhm.
them feel unique about
Yeah.
themselves. So they continue something that's going to make them feel better in an area or a society that they don't fit in.
Yeah.
And for, you know, athletes, or, you know, as you were using the example of wrestlers, once you've started restricting, you lose your hunger cues. So for you and I,
Mhm.
you know, we get hungry for breakfast and lunch and dinner, but when you start restricting and modifying your food intake, you lose those hunger cues, um, that an ordinary person has throughout the day to know that they're hungry and ready to
Yeah.
eat. So
Yeah.
it can go on for a while, and then eventually people crash because they get to such a significant low weight that it's noticeable. You know, people around them are saying, "You've lost a lot of weight. Are you okay?"
Yeah.
They get weaker. Their skin tone usually turns gray. And when
Mhm.
it gets to that point, that's really when there needs to be a medical intervention for hospitalization on refeeding.
Yeah.
So it's when in the grips of the eating disorder, they don't know how far they are into it until
Mhm.
it's too late,
Too late.
unfortunately.
Yeah. And then does it like when it's kind of too late and you've kind of crossed over that line, where it, you know, becomes sort of an addictive type of, like is that the kind of cycle? I think I've seen 12-step programs out there for eating disorders. I
Yeah.
mean, which people have all kinds of different opinions about 12 steps and all kind for a lot of arenas, but you know, then it kind of becomes the behavior becomes sort of addictive. Like, well, what is kind of that connection between, or should we even use the word addiction when we think about eating disorders?
So I think you can use addiction because it's in a form of an addiction.
Okay.
So very similar to someone that struggles in substance abuse, they're chasing that high.
Yeah.
With someone with an eating disorder, it's a different high. You know, when I restrict food and I've accomplished that I ate less than what I did the day before, that's the high. Or when someone binge eats and they get to the point in their binge disorder that the food is just going in, but they have no control over how much is going in.
Yeah.
And as my patients have described it, it's like an out of body experience. They have
Interesting.
two different personalities. So when they are in their eating disorder, they have, you know, the personality where they're doing what they need to do, they're good students, they're not lying, they're not manipulating. But then when they're in the grips of their eating disorder, very similar to substance abuse disorder, you know, the lying, the manipulation, the control takes over so much that it gets to the point that they have, the eating disorder has full control over their decision making
Mhm.
and what's going on around them.
Yeah. Wow. So you mentioned, and one of the things I'm really interested in nutritional science as part of a, you know, and we've kind of had these conversations about kind of wellness being a foundational piece of overall mental and physical cognitive health. And, you know, nutritional science is always fascinating for me because they seem to screw it up so often. I'm old
Absolutely.
enough to remember when fat was bad, and so we put sugar in everything, and
Yep.
like now sugar's the new cocaine, and I'm like,
Mhm.
well, wait a minute, you weren't around during the crack epidemic because, nobody's, sugar is not the new cocaine, but it's like they make these broad statements, and now it's like I can take a bath in olive oil, which I think is a good thing. But like, but I remember, and I hate that this is still around because of the research on it, but like the Atkins diet, and I would watch some of my friends who were struggling with obesity sit down with 1.5 pounds of meat and think that was healthy for them. And I'm like, it's not, and I didn't have any science to back it up. But I kind of wonder how your folks who may be susceptible to this because of trauma, because of outside pressures, and then we have these rotating diet fads.
Yeah.
Some of them stick around for what seems like paleo's got some stickiness. The keto, there seems to be something. I'm actually a proponent, at least for myself, and of intermittent fasting, which I want to talk about here in a second too. But like what does the world seem like to the folks who have this vulnerability, and there's a new thing thrown at them every 20 to 30 minutes of eat this way and you will look that way, sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, most of the patients that I've worked with, they've done the yo-yo dieting, what we call, they've done the fad dieting. They want the fast fix. And a lot of these diets, that's what they market to. If you remove fats, if you remove carbs from your diet, you will get this result.
Yeah.
So when someone struggles with an eating disorder, they obsess about removing those things from their diet entirely. Our job in the eating disorder clinic is we reintroduce those food groups to them, which sometimes is such an anxiety provoking and traumatizing experience for them.
Yeah.
Because in their brain, it says, this is bad. I will get fat if I eat this. But then they have to trust us as professionals when we say it's okay, you need to have these things. So in our clinic specifically, we have a registered dietitian that she's been working with the eating disorder population for years. And she actually creates a meal plan for each patient that she meets with to look at where they need to be with their weight at their age and what's going to be a healthy body image, body type for them, right? So Tammy, our dietitian, want to give her props because she does a lot for us. She meets with each patient, and she, most of our meal plans, we focus on 3 meals a day, because when people struggle with an eating disorder, they start to eliminating those meals from their day. So we're reintroducing them, and each meal has the appropriate nutritional value, but it also has each category that they need to have. So there is no elimination of carbs. There is no elimination of fats. And within our meal plan, we shy away from calories, because when struggling with an eating disorder, you can count calories and become so obsessive that I need to only consume this many calories a day in order to stay a certain weight. So we do not give our patients the options to even know the calories. Our meal plans are set up in a way that we say exchanges. So, breakfast, they may only need 1 carb, 1 protein, 1 fat, and then lunch could look different. So then they're not focusing, okay, I need 500 here, I need 600 here, and I need 500 somewhere else. We also emphasize snacks, which is something that our society is shied away from. So usually within our meal plans, they also have to have 2 snacks a day. So throughout the day, there's no option to bring up the intermittent fasting. There's no option of fasting. The goal is that they will eat every 3 to 4 hours so that their bodies become adjusted with reintroducing food and having a regular relationship with those food groups, but also with meals and snacks.
Interesting. And so one of the things, and I heard this and I was like, I gotta ask Kate about this. And so this may be like totally off the wall, but I've been really in lately doing a deep dive, and it goes to the heart rate variability stuff. I'm so interested in the polyvagal theory, where we talk about Stephen Porges and others talk about, like, we got the ventral vagal, which is our safe and social piece, then you move down the nervous system into the sympathetic fight or flight, and then the dorsal vagal, which is kind of the freeze. And I just love to get your opinion on this. This is just me nerding out with you, with an audience listening to us. One of the things he was interested in is he says a lot of times with the folks he's worked with eating disorders, there's the anxiety or depression. So a lot of times they're in sympathetic or dorsal vagal, depression or anxiety. And so he sees that messes up because, when we're in ventral vagal, our dorsal is doing digestion. But when we're kind of off balance and lower down in our nervous system, that digestion gets all thrown off. One of the things he was interested in, and it was kind of a thought that he had, so I thought I'd throw it to you as an expert, is trying to get people to rethink their mealtime and having like social conversations while they eat. So to make eating, in his way, he wanted them to have conversations so they would be activating ventral vagal instead of having anxiety or reaction. I just kind of wonder, is social interaction, I guess maybe the better question is the ritual of the meal. Does that come into your thinking in any way? I just had to ask you that question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When struggling with an eating disorder, it becomes very isolating. So that, as the farther you get into your eating this disorder, the more you don't want to be around people. You don't want to have them watch you eat. You feel judged for what you're eating. And what we encourage at our clinic is to eat together. So our clients sit together and we go through the meal with them. If they are struggling with, say, having the pasta, they have not only a clinical staff there to coach them through it, and at times we have our nutritionist, but they also have their peers to give them that positive feedback. And we encourage conversation throughout the meal for all of them to be engaged with one another. So then they are aware of, having that normal meal, feeling that they're engaged, feeling that they're not alone, feeling connected to people, because when they're struggling with their eating disorder, they do feel alone.
Yeah.
They do feel like no one cares about them. So, we spend the time and we sit there and, I've heard about all the newest social media. I'm hearing about TikTok. I don't know much about TikTok. But, we talk a lot about, what they're into and how they connect with one another.
Yeah.
And then, over the course of the meal, since it's such a vulnerable moment for them in their treatment, they build a bond with one another because they're coaching one another through that process. So it is important that when someone is struggling with an eating disorder, to sit with them, to talk to them. The misconception is when people have an eating disorder, people stare at them, look at their plate. And the best thing you can do is normalize the experience. It doesn't help when you feel that you're under a microscope when the thing that you fear is the plate in front of you.
Right.
We forget that the eating disorder, food is the fear, food is the enemy.
Yes.
So if, say, you feared a snake, you would be startled, and the snake is the meal for them, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just a matter of just saying, well, just eat then. A lot of our patients' families or their friends say, well, why don't you just eat? Why can't you eat? And it's not a matter of just eating. It's so much more than that.
Yeah. Well, and again, good job. Stephen Porges is right again. But I think he's, the interesting thing I'm hearing from you and is, the polyvagal, that you're not, you're, it's a different experience. And again, for me to eat, and sometimes eating for me is just a throwaway activity. It's like, I think sometimes the more I just think about food is, hey, I'm not a guy that wants to spend 3 hours cooking a meal. It's just not something I'm interested in doing. So it's like, let's try to get the healthiest thing in my body as quickly as possible and then go on with my day. So it's something like I hardly ever think about. But I think that to get in the right kind of biological mental state for somebody, because one of the things I think I always struggled with for those, and this may come from more from friends that I know that have struggled with this, is a lot of times what I saw them working on it, and as I started my career out in substance abuse, it was like bringing people, like, let's say people struggling with alcoholism, bringing them around a table together and saying, okay, we know alcohol has destroyed your life, but we're going to drink. Because and that was just such a hard thing, is because they had to eat. It's something that we don't really, I mean, I guess we do have a choice about it, but there's, we can only go so long without food before we die.
Absolutely.
And that's why I just have so much empathy for folks that struggle with it, because you gotta eat to sustain. You don't have to have another drop of alcohol your entire life and you could be healthier because of it. But this is something that you have to almost face that addiction every time you sit down to eat. And I just think that's an incredibly powerful thing to overcome.
And I think that's why it's sometimes so much harder to work through than struggling with a substance abuse disorder. Yeah. So some of our patients, they struggle with both. And one of the questions I've said to them, especially, having the experience in substance abuse as well, what have you found has been a harder struggle? And every time the answer is their eating disorder, because like they said, I need to have food. Yeah. I can't avoid having food, and trying to figure out that relationship with food that's healthy. Like most of the patients say, I can avoid going to the liquor store, I can avoid going to the bar, but I can't avoid going to the grocery store, and I can't avoid having food.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another question that I have found a lot of folks have struggled with around this, is the codependency issues around this. You mentioned a lot of this comes out of family. And I think, the other thing that I've seen, just sort of, again, sort of as treatment provider, but also just as a friend of folks over the years, is like, it's how are you supportive of somebody? Because, I think we're very hesitant, and I as a clinician, I'm always like on the watch out for codependency and try to help people not be codependent, even though they got their best issues, is, how would you suggest, whether it's a friend, whether it's a family member who doesn't necessarily want to say, should you eat that? You shouldn't eat that. You got to eat. Like, I think that's the other thing, is like drinking can be an all or nothing sort of thing. But how about people that love folks struggling with this, or maybe they're in a treatment environment and trying to be supportive? Do you have any suggestions? Because I see this a big thing around this, is people want to help, but they end up oftentimes making the problem and making the person struggling with the disorder feel worse.
Absolutely. So I think the best way for a family member or a friend to be supportive is not to focus so much on the food. That when we say, have you ate too much, or you didn't eat enough, it's too anxiety provoking. So it's trying to have normalized conversations and not putting such a microscope on what's going on, and asking, are you struggling? Validating some of those feelings versus saying, like, maybe you should eat more, because it sounds very judgmental. That when someone's in the grips of their eating disorder, some of the messages that come out, they get misconstrued because of their eating disorder. If they hear someone say, well, should you eat more, or did you eat enough? They say, well, am I too thin? Am I too fat? Versus thinking that this person genuinely cares about my well-being and wants me to eat.
Right. Or you look, I mean, the other thing that I've seen is like if you go back to classic behavioralism and the reward system, is you're looking great. Well, you may have just purged, there's like this odd, like, sometimes you may get, at least initially, some positive feedback or something like that, and it just sort of kind of skews the internal experience of rewards. And like you said, that social aspect of it too, you've got to look this way to be beautiful in our society. I just think puts so many people in horrible positions if you're not, born genetically with those genes that allow you to be that way. And we all know, knowing people that have been in the ultra fitness sort of arena, a lot of them look that way. Even like, I heard people, some of the podcasts, to get on the cover of Men's Health, you don't eat for 5 days, so that's not even a real representation of the person. And then they airbrush every flaw they have away. So yeah, it's that societal pressure as well. It's like you get rewarded for things that may even reinforce the thinking around the disorder in a way that I don't think is, I look at other mental health issues and diagnoses. Eating disorders have always stood out as very rare in that category with that piece to it.
Yeah. And especially when you start struggling with an eating disorder, you don't realize that this is something that you're struggling with.
Yeah.
This is your thing. This is your way of coping. And then when you get those positive results and you get that positive feedback, it just reinforces the eating disorder to say, see what you're doing, it's getting you skinnier, and now people are liking you. So it's that voice in their head of constant, focus on the way that they look.
Yeah.
And that voice is so strong in their heads. And as they reintroduce food back into their diet, that's when we say the voice starts to decrease, the volume starts to decrease. But when they're in the trenches of their eating disorder, it's so loud, and that, their eating disorder saying, don't eat this, but then, their mom or dad saying, you need to eat those potatoes, and their eating disorder saying, if you eat those potatoes, you're going to get fat. Don't listen to your parents. They don't know what they're talking about. And that when a loved one is watching someone struggle with an eating disorder, they don't know that dialogue that's going on in that person's head as they're suffering. A lot of people are shameful of saying, this is what's going on in my head, and this is how I view myself.
Right. Yeah. And so, that's powerful. And so you've got this whole thing set up, and then, so what advice would you give for maybe somebody with like the dangerous amount of information that I kind of have, but maybe someone in private practice and a maybe the child welfare, whether it's residential, foster care, but we're working with these people in these kind of clinical kind of social support, helping maybe even medical providers working with folks that aren't necessarily focused on diagnosing and treating eating disorders, but as we're talking again, it just expands the focus I should have had in parts of my career and expanded some of my stereotypes out differently. So what are some signs for folks that again, this might not be their focus, but as we talk about trauma making people more vulnerable to either overeating or undereating or everything we're talking about, what are some things and signs that we might look for to maybe signal us to do a deeper analysis or try to refer to a specialist like yourself?
So I think for most people that work in the clinical realm, whether it's substance abuse, mental health, or doing private practice, that it really should be part of the assessment process, because eating disorders are far more prevalent than what we perceive them to be in our profession. I know prior to working in the eating disorder sector, I didn't realize how many people struggled with their relationship with food. And, everywhere I work, I think, man, I wish I would have had this experience. When I worked in substance abuse, we focused so much on, the drugs and alcohol that they were using, the lifestyle, the people around them, that this was something that I didn't consider. I didn't consider what the relationship was with food. And I had plenty of patients in groups in substance abuse that would say, well, I only ate one meal a day because I was so focused on chasing heroin. And, I didn't think as a clinician to focus my attention on, okay, this person only ate one meal a day. How is this impacting their mental state, their emotional state? And is this something that started when they started their substance abuse history, or was this something that they struggled with childhood but are too embarrassed to talk to people, that they have so much shame and guilt around the way they view their bodies, but also the way that they view food and the relationship that they have? So I think by incorporating, a screening tool for patients to assess if they are restricting food, if they're using laxatives, if they're using diuretics, have they ever purged, do they overeat? Some of those basic questions can go a long way. And what I've noticed, especially now working with patients, they say to me, Kate, it's so nice to work with someone that specializes in eating disorders, because as I went through my therapy journey before, none of my therapists knew how to work with me on the eating disorder or didn't say the right thing. So then it just enabled the eating disorder for me. And it feels so nice to have that person that understands the thoughts in our head, understands the body image. So then you can support us moving forward. And I think it's something that we don't take seriously, but it's a serious issue in our society right now.
Yeah.
Social media has increased the level of vulnerability for people to have an eating disorder.
Yeah. Well, and your cognitive behavioral kind of reprogramming, which is not nearly as bad as it sounds if you've never heard that term, but we're helping people think differently. I mean, that's a level of expertise. I was never, in 3 years of grad school to become a therapist, I can't remember ever getting this on my radar until I started to work with populations that were struggling with this. And then it's like, I've got to find experts on this because I could do more harm than good without that. So I appreciate that, just listening to your approach and working with a nutritionist and working on the relationship with food, eating socially, all those key things. We're not trained in any way from the treatment perspective, unless you probably go search it out as a supplement to your expertise. But even to diagnose, it's something that, you're binging, and that comes up in conversation, the red light will go off. But, I think to identify that earlier on, so critical. Yeah.
And I think when someone sees a clinician in private practice, whether it's depression or anxiety, they think sometimes the priority is the anxiety and depression, but don't realize it could be the fact that they've had an eating disorder for years, which just increases the anxiety and depression, and they don't talk about it to the therapist. So the therapist thinks that they're only treating, specific mental health disorders, but there are other disorders that are coming into play that are impacting how well someone does.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a big, and this is a much more general statement, but it's like, to me, the whole idea of nutrition and to some extent wellness, we've just, in the mental health world, have ignored at our great peril. And I think the eating disorder conversation is in some ways a little bit of the extreme situation with this, but it's like, I just think about the families I worked with in poverty who were living in food deserts without, where a corner gas station was their grocery store. And if you want to try to eat healthy at a gas station, a convenience store, good luck. There might be a 6-day-old apple that everybody's coughed on right up front, but it's like, we've missed this. And one of the pieces of research I'm paying attention for, because I think it's like the anti-inflammatory versus non-inflammatory foods, because if we're under stress, if we have that anxiety or that depression, we know that causes inflammation in our body. And then we eat processed foods, we eat unhealthy foods, trans fats, all this stuff that is in the, unfortunately, American impoverished diet, that we all of a sudden are exacerbating that biological reaction to stress. And, so I feel, it's like, boy, we got to think about this educationally. Obviously the social pressure is, something I think we're just going to continue to struggle and fight against. But yeah, it's that nutritional piece of it, so critical to our nervous system, brain health. And, obviously with the spectrum of folks you're dealing with, they've had probably, I imagine, their nervous system's reaction to, like you said, the yo-yo diet's probably more extreme, in many ways. Boy, I bet their nervous system probably needs a long time to just kind of stabilize and then regain that health, almost take a deep breath from what it's been through.
And a lot of what we incorporate at the clinic is, teaching them mindfulness practices to,
awesome.
To relax their central nervous system, because it is very anxiety provoking and they do feel like their body's out of control. For some people, their eating disorder started because of anxiety, having the nervous stomach, feeling like loss of appetite, and it just continues based on the level of stress that's going on in their life. Or as some other people, to cope with stress and the nervous stomach, I'm going to emotionally eat. It makes me feel better. It's that comfort. It's that blanket. And before you know it, you don't even realize that that's what you're doing. And it becomes such a habit that once you get into that habit, it's so hard to stop it when your brain says, this is what makes me feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to kind of wrap up with just kind of giving you an open space. This has been, I feel like I have read a book in the 45 minutes we've been doing this. So I appreciate that. I just kind of wonder, are there any additional myths or suggestions that you would like, any myths you'd like to contradict about maybe conceptions out there about eating disorders that you like drive you nuts? Or just other suggestions for folks like myself who are probably maybe working more with people struggling with food than we realize. I just kind of want to give you an open space to, if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you feel like I should know, and other people and kind of my uninformed situation should know about this moving forward.
So I would say to the general public, but also to people working clinically, that eating disorders are not what we typically view. They're not the, very thin patient. You can have an eating disorder and look very healthy. So that's why it's so important to have those questions, because, a lot of times when I'm working with the patients, they say, Kate, I don't look sick enough. If they don't look very thin or very overweight, I'm not sick enough. Maybe I shouldn't be in treatment. I'm not worthy of this. There are other people that deserve this more than I do. So I think in terms of our profession, we really need to start screening people and having some of those honest conversations to see if people are struggling with food and viewing themselves in this negative way and feeling that they need to change the way that they look in order to be accepted by others and loved by others.
Beautifully put. And I think, just saying those words would put another 20% of my patient population, I'd have questions about that again. And I think, a lot of times we think, oh, disorder, you have to meet all these DSM diagnostic material. But I think, people just struggling with that, the control around eating, that comfort eating. I think we all can relate to that in some ways. How, as I train and travel and get to choose my restaurants, it's okay, am I going to have the salad I know I'm supposed to eat? But I've done a whole day of training and I convinced myself I burned 3,000 calories. So it's like, oh, I can have the French fries and the tater tots. So, it's I think we can all see this a little bit in our own behavior, but then understanding that struggle puts people at a much higher risk for the disorder and the health consequences of this as well.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So I would I usually don't ask this, but I wonder if we could include in the show notes if you have any assessments or books, because I think a lot of people are like myself. It's like this conversation alerts me to a lot of learning I need to do. So I wonder if you would, and you don't have to give them right now, but we could put those in the show notes for folks that might want to continue to learn on this. And can you just give a little bit, I want to give you some time to to brag about, because I've been following y'all. Speaking of social media, there is a good point to it all. Some of the great work, your organization sounds pretty amazing on what they're doing, both from what I'm seeing online, but also what you're saying here. So I want to give you a little chance just to end up, if there's any favorite resources, maybe to give those. We'll also put those in the show notes, but also brag about where you work a little bit as well.
So I have to say it's an honor working at HPA LiveWell. I work with a great team of individuals that we're very dedicated to the population that we serve, and we are always brainstorming different ideas to meet their needs. And especially in this weird time of COVID, we had to all together figure out how we were going to continue to provide outpatient services and meet the needs of our patients. And we have utilized Zoom, and we do all of our groups on Zoom. We do all of our meals still with patients on Zoom. They have to show us their plates. They have to show us their empty plates. We monitor, bathroom breaks, and, we every day meet together and discuss patients, discuss how they're feeling. And what I can't do that day, my colleagues pick up, and I'm very grateful for that. Very grateful for the opportunity that I have. And it's very cool that we're moving in the direction we are. We're trying to use technology more to meet the needs of our patients. When we get back to the clinic, we have a smart board in our group room that for a while was just hanging there. But now, we've thrown out different ideas of, how do we use technology in our favor to do groups and think outside of the box? That, traditional therapy, it helps, but it also helps to spice things up as we're working with a population of teenagers that are tech savvy. We've all become tech savvy. We also have our own Instagram page and Facebook page that we provide information to the general population to educate people, because we know that it's a topic that a lot of people don't know about, and that their perceptions of eating disorders is not what the truth is and what we hear in our rooms and the story of our clients. So, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work with my team, and we're moving in a fun direction. I think with COVID, it has brought us together stronger, and our patients are very grateful for the team that we have and the level of enthusiasm and energy that we provide to all of our patients.
Yeah, I know you just talk so highly of it, and that's great to hear. So we'll throw the link to that online if people want more information, a little information and contact information for Kate. Kate, if you can give us any assessments, books for those that might want to continue their learning experience, we'll put all that, the show notes at traumainformedlens.org. Kate, thanks for educating me. I feel like I did really step in it, which was my kind of goal for this one. But I feel like I learned a lot more. And like I said, I wish I would have had this conversation 25 years ago, because again, I'm thinking about folks that if I had this lens on, I probably could have got them an additional level of support that I just wasn't looking for. So I appreciate you putting this on everybody's radar, and have to have you come back soon and continue this conversation.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, Matt. That's what I enjoy about this part, is just the education, because I know that a lot of people don't know about it. And I have to say, I received all my education from the patient, so I can't take full credit that it was textbook or education. It's been listening to the patients, listening to the struggle. Our patients are very vulnerable with us, and it's such a humbling experience to listen through the struggles that they've gone through and be a part of the supportive process that they need and they deserve. So it's been an honor, and thank you for having me.
Well, they might never know it, but the fact that you're able then to share that with the rest of the world and impact lives, hopefully give them a little bit of that feedback if it's ever appropriate from a random podcaster old guy that I'm learning from them through you as well. So Kate, thank you so very much. Again, traumainformedlens.org, get the show notes, keep your learning, and Kate, we'll have you back soon to continue our conversation.
Absolutely.